All right, it is pro tip lecture time. And in this lecture, we're going to walk through how to create a moving average that uses average X. So this is the code that we're actually going to create in Power BI in a couple of minutes. But first, let's walk through exactly kind of what's going on here. First up, we're using variables to define certain parameters for our inputs. The first one that we're using is for last transaction date. And we're using a max function here that is going to look at our max transaction date based on our current filter context and our visual. Next, we're defining the average days. So this is the number of days that we actually want to adjust by within the period. Right? So we could update this to 7 to look at the previous week, 14 for the previous 2 weeks, so on and so forth. For the period and visual, we're using filter, all, and to define the time period of the rolling window. And the rolling window is based on the last transaction date in the current filter context of the visual, meaning that if the point in the visual is July 28th, 2018, that's the latest date in the current filter context. If it was September 6th, 2018, that would be the latest date in the current filter context. And the function is adjusting 30 days back based on that last visible transaction date. So once we have that window defined, we can then use calculate to return the average daily customer sales for the period we've defined. And one thing to note here is that you could actually turn this moving average code into a rolling total or a rolling count by substituting something like SumX or CountX for where you see average X here below calculate. So you could use this to calculate a moving sum or a moving count within the same period. Lastly, we return the output of this equation to close out the measure. Pro tip here, one of the things that you can actually do is you could create a parameter and substitute that for our average days, that static average day value, and this would let you create a dynamic user-defined period that would automatically adjust within the visual. With that, let's go build this and test it out for ourselves. All right. So first things first, let's create our measure. And I'm going to call this moving average using average X. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to define those variables that we saw, right? So the first variable that we want to define is the last transaction date. And this is going to equal max calendar table, the transaction date from our calendar table. I'll close this out. The next variable we want to define is the average days, right? So the number of days within the period that we want to look back. And I'm going to set this to 30. Next up is we need to create the time period within the visual. So period and visual. And this is where we're going to use filter with all, and the calendar table, transaction date. Right, so what we said right there is basically we're using filter to return a table, and we want it filtered based on certain parameters. And the first thing that we're doing is we're clearing all of the filters that may exist on transaction date. The second thing that we want to do is we want to use AND. AND allows us to create a logical expression that if both arguments evaluate to true, then it will return true. So here's where we want to enter in the logical statements to basically time box this 30-day period. So again, this is going to be based on the calendar transaction date. And this is if it's greater than the last transaction date minus the average days, and the transaction date is less than or equal to the last transaction date, right? Then we'll return true. So what this block of code here is saying, this filter parameter for filter, is that let's use a specific date as an example here. So for our first parameter of AND here, we're looking to see if this evaluates to true, right? So if July 28th the current calendar date, is greater than the last transaction date here, which is also the max date based on the current context. So this is basically saying July 28th is greater than July 28th minus 30, if that's true, and if July 28th is less than or equal to July 28th, then return true. And because both of those evaluate to true, what we're doing is we're providing a filter here. If this was July 28th, we're providing a table that's filtered from June 28th to July 28th. So that's a breakdown of exactly what's happening here within the filter parameter of this function. So now we're going to create another variable for the output. And this is where we're going to use calculate, right? The expression that we want to calculate is going to be the same average X expression that we had used in a previous lecture to create the daily customer sales, right? So we want to look at the calendar table, and the expression is going to be customer sales. And our filter is going to be period and visual. So what I was saying in the slides is you could change average X here to SumX or CountX and change this moving average into a moving total or a moving count. And then lastly, what we need to do here is return the output. And again, once this loads, we'll change our home table and we will format this as a currency. 2 decimal places. Great. So now we'll close this out, and I'm going to move a couple of these visuals around here. And we're going to create a line and clustered column chart that is going to look at the transaction date, customer sales, and our average X sales. All right, so we'll add this visual in, and let's grab our transaction date from the calendar table, and we'll put this on our shared axes. Next up, customer sales. Grab our customer sales measure and throw this on the column values. All right, so now we have all of our customer sales trended out by day. And the last piece here we can do is we'll add in our moving average sales to our line values. Right? So there we go. Now we have a 30-day moving average that is layered over our sales. Right? So here on June 16th, 2018, our moving average for the last 30 days, our average sales over the last 30 days was $5,709.63. We check out another value here. November 30th, 2018, our average sales for the last 30 days was $6,146, right? So that's how you create a moving average using average X and some variables. That wraps up this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one.